Hi, everybody. Welcome to This Week in Innovation. I'm Jeff Roster, former Gartner and IHL retail sector analyst, now serving on several advisory boards, and most recently joining the Advisory Council for the Center for Retail Transformation at George Mason University. I'm here with my podcast partner, Brian Sathianathan, co-founder of Iterate.ai and a veteran of several successful exits. Today's subject matter is how artificial intelligence can develop a bias and what to do about it. For today's discussion, Solomon Ray, Director of Innovation at Iterate.ai, joins us to offer his insights. Give it a listen. Well, good morning, Brian. I understand today we have a fascinating subject and maybe even a little bit controversial. Today we want to talk about artificial intelligence and is it biased? So, Brian, biased. Why don't you unpack exactly what you're thinking and what some of your research that you've just recently found, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Jeff. Super excited and to talk about this topic, everyone. And I think this is one of the areas a lot of the folks and executives and leaders that I've been speaking to have been concerned about. AI is great; it is a wonderful workhorse. But what happens when AI becomes more than a workhorse? What happens? What about all the bias that AI has? Right? In today's session, we are going to slowly unpack. And we are also happy to have Solomon here. Solomon is the Director of Innovation in our company at Iterate.ai. He's also a strategist. He works with large brands, retailers, and various leaders to help them, educate them in various forms of emerging technologies. So he's going to share us some of his views as well. But before we go there, I want to quickly give a quick introduction to this. This is more important, I think, as the use of AI is becoming more and more pervasive as large organizations are beginning to use AI in every one of their departments. It's a horizontal force across the entire organization, right? As organizations are beginning to use AI, one of the things that's happening here is that the data or the output that comes out of the AI products or the suites, they do have biases in terms of predicting, various forms of information or even learning, right? And we'll begin to unpack that pretty soon. But at a higher level, what happens is, imagine you walk into a retailer or a brand, right? Just because of your ethnicity, your demographic, you may get denied credit, right? Or you may be looking for some sort of interview, and you may not get selected. That is, the candidates are screened by some sort of an HR AI system, right? You might be going to a beauty company and looking at products, and you may not have products that match your color tone and your skin tone, right? So this type of problems are across every industry, right? These are some of the early manifestations of some of the challenges in the bias that AI has. But at the same time, we also want to understand very clearly. In fact, Solomon can elaborate more deeply to us. Is that all these problems are not just AI's problems. These are inherent human problems with the data that AI has been processing. Right. Over the last couple of years, we've been seeing a lot of press articles, press have taken it out of proportion because it's a fascinating story, right? Oh, AI is failing or AI's got this problem, right? But as AI begins to mature, we'll also look at methods, how various forms of models and technologies can help clean up and alleviate some of these challenges, right? And having said that, I'm going to sort of turn it over to Solomon. Solomon, can you explain us what AI bias is, right?
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian. AI bias is the irregularity that occurs when an algorithm produces results that are systematically prejudiced due to erroneous assumptions in the machine learning process, including the algorithm development and prejudicial training data. And that's kind of a mouthful, but I think what's really important to emphasize is that AI is a tool. And so by itself, it doesn't have inherent bias. But as Brian alluded to, what we do with it how we apply it, that can amplify a lot of those effects. So across different industries, even beyond retail, we see AI bias pop up, and it can be very benign. So for example, maybe you're doing some kind of personal identification using facial recognition, and maybe it just doesn't work for you the first couple of times. So you have to scan your face or detect yourself a few times. And maybe for a retail setting, that's more of a nuisance. It's benign. But take that all the way to the other spectrum, something like law enforcement, where maybe they're using AI detection and misidentifies somebody, and then uses that and gets a warrant, and then you can get convicted of a crime based on AI. And we've seen that's an actual case that happens. So it runs the spectrum, and the applications that we see. AI systems contain two biases that we see, and it's mostly through our human biases. Number one, we see cognitive biases. Human biases could seep into machine learning algorithms, either designers unknowingly introducing them to the model, or a training data set which includes those biases. And number two, just simply the lack of complete data. So the data is not complete, it might not be representative, and therefore that lack of information is a bias in itself.
So that's pretty interesting, Solomon. If you had a truly diverse team, would you still have those biases, or is it how do we stop that, or how do we correct it?
Not necessarily, because when we say a diverse team, that can be a lot of different things. That could be just a team of developer engineers, data scientists creating it. But that doesn't mean the data set is free of bias itself. So I'll give you an example. So if you use a facial cropping tool that uses machine learning model, and it's supposed to identify people's faces. So if this model is using data from different online sources, specifically public data sets, that data itself, even though we assume, well, it's on the internet, it's public, it's a large data set, it should be free from bias, right? We're not, we have our own team. We're being very conscious about how we approach this. But if we kind of think about it, for example, if you're collecting public photos from Flickr, you kind of have to think of like, when was Flickr really, really relevant? So maybe around 2009. So what is kind of the majority demographic that's uploading pictures on Flickr? So all those photos that you're using to train your model is going to be skewed on that. And what we've also seen from the Flickr example is that for certain people of color, it's not as salient as even cats. So what you'll see is that the model is going to recognize certain skin tones more quicker, and even animals like household pets more than other people of color. And that has nothing to do with the makeup of the team. It has everything to do with the data and where that data is coming from.
Well, that's really interesting. So is this a problem for retail? Is this a problem more for the software manufacturers at this point? Probably for both, I guess. Absolutely.
It is on both sides. And it is something that an organization has to be very conscious about. Even this year's CES, where Google was part of a panel to talk about AI bias in gender. The point that was made is you have to be very intentional in your results. So if you think about something like bias, you might think about just something on the grounds of your team. But if you don't have a diverse team, and often a lot of tech companies don't, the next probably best thing is that you need to have a team that tests your products that's diverse. So that's kind of one of the mantras that Google takes. They're very intentional. They're trying to be very intentional in their results. So to answer your question about whether this is a problem for retailers or software. For a retailer, if you want to fully represent your customer base, and we talk about changing demographics, and it's not just like racial, we're talking about age and different demographics. Sometimes you just don't have that data, and so you need to find methods to kind of boost that up. We see bias in even things like income stratification. So you might have data that's skewed more towards men in terms of income, but as a retailer, you just don't want to look at it on face value. You know that there are other groups that you do want to reach out to, but the raw data available doesn't address that. So this isn't just something where you can say, okay, well, software team, can you fix it? It's definitely a collaborative effort.
Yeah. The other thing also, Jeff, that can happen here is that just like CCPA, right, California Privacy Act, and GDPR, right, the European privacy laws, right. In the future, there could be a world where various governing bodies or maybe even governments could mandate that retailers and other consumer-facing outlets be compliant with non-biased AI. That means the responsibility for making sure that their AI is compliant and non-biased. Right, that will be, and there may be a world for AI compliance. Right, every AI used in their products or solutions have to be compliant with certain and have to be eliminating certain forms of biases. Right, so there could be a world where within a few years, as AI becomes more pervasive, that just like the way they are being compliant today with GDPR or CCPA, they might have to be compliant with some AI bias standards. Right. So at that point, the responsibility will suddenly be falling on the hands of the retailers and various forms of companies that are providing these consumer-facing type solutions, right? And eventually those things will get translated to the vendors to make sure that their solutions are compliant and bias-free, or have been taken certain methods to sort of bias tested, right?
So when I hear the word responsibility or responsibility falling on a retailer, I also hear the word opportunity for a service provider or software maker or something. Is this a new market that's going to evolve? Certification of your AI, or what do retail executives need to, that are hearing this podcast? What do they need to be thinking about today, and what do they need to be preparing for tomorrow?
No, that's a great question, Jeff, because I think this responsibility is probably the right word. Today it's not in the shape or the form of responsibility. But in the coming years, it's going to turn into a significant responsibility, right? So I think there will be certain forms of governing bodies and laws or things to kind of clean up AI, right? So if something like that happens, most likely that will fall under there is a sub-market segment today under AI called AI governance. So it will fall into the AI governance subsection, right? That market today is very, very tiny, right? From the vendor side, I think it's like $50-60 million based on various online, research organization predictions, right, and numbers. But that could easily, there are some predictions that say that could go into probably around 300 million, right? So in the next coming years, things will begin to unfold in this space where AI governance will take a front and center step.
Wow, that's interesting. Always like to hear about new markets. I'm not sure how exciting this market's going to be, though, since it sounds like it's pretty complex and rapidly evolving. Brian or Solomon, I'm curious, is there an okay bias? I mean, for instance, let's say some of the beauty retailers, I got to assume their customer base has got to be 85-90% female versus male. Maybe something like a Bass Pro is probably skewed the other way. Is it okay to have a bias if it meets your customer demographics?
I think that's an interesting point, Jeff. But I think what happens is, like Solomon kind of touched on it, right? The benign biases, right, versus biases that are much more, much more harmful, to a consumer trend, right, and to a consumer day in a life, right. Some of these current biases are seen as very early benign biases, right? But that also adds to the fact that AI is still considered a new technology and a new force. Both the consumers as well as the brands and retailers and organizations that are using it are quite forgiving, right? But once it becomes table stake, I think people will be less forgiving, right? Even benign biases would be considered, people would not tolerate or put up with them. Solomon, do you have any views?
I think you touch upon an interesting point, Jeff. So this idea of if my data set is skewed because my customers tend to be skewed, is that all right? So I'll kind of tackle it in layers. The first being that if you are looking to expand your market and your data set, consumer data, is skewed toward your existing customers, but doesn't really apply for another one. So we take gender as an example. If you're mostly selling to women and you want to expand to a men's market, it's going to be very, very difficult for your existing data, and all those AI applications you built is going to be very difficult to translate into such another market. And we don't just see this in demographics. We also see this on the product level. So, for example, if you're talking about smaller brands or startup indie brands that want to go to the market, and if you compare it to a more established brand, the bias is going to be more for the more established brands, for retailer. But then you're going to miss all these opportunities where there could be niche markets where there's like really strong, fervent devotions to smaller brands, because all your data is going to be skewed towards the bigger brands. And when I say the data, as in like the way that you might have data about their packaging, ingredients, like different sizes, all these things are very incumbent with the larger manufacturers. But if you're talking about like a smaller mom and pop brand that's kind of selling things online and they have a really passionate following, that can fall under the radar. And these are opportunities you can miss if you're just kind of using your old data and then kind of building recommendation models based on that. The second thing I want to point out is there's an aggregation bias. So that just means that you might have a lot of data, but then you don't really divide it into subgroups, and then you just assume, well, everything, all my data is good. I gave good results, so I'm just going to go ahead and approach it accordingly. So an example of this could be going back to like income. You might say like, well, my average consumer is of, this profile, makes this much income, is at this age group. And then generally I get really high conversion rates. My margins are X, and that's pretty good. But if you actually break it up into subgroups, you might realize like there actually is a huge discrepancy within, it could be gender, it could be education, or anything like that. So we have to be very, very careful about just assuming our data, looking at it as a whole, thinking that, well, this data, these are my customers, this is good enough, so I'm going to run a model. Again, like product recommendations, how to run campaigns, their preferences, etc., customer lifetime value, etc. And that may not be applicable for the subgroups within that huge data set you're looking at.
Wow, something else for a retail CIO to worry about. Brian, do you have a sense at how big of a problem this is today? And I guess how big of a problem it's going to be out 2 or 3 years?
I think, Jeff, like I mentioned before, today the problem is still very at an experimental stage. It's a bigger problem for companies in the finance sector, companies in the insurance sector, where they have to make a significant judgment call based on these things, right? Where the decisions are much more serious and non-benign, right? It's also a pretty large problem for the government and various public sector organizations, right? Because they are using AI in a much more deeper way, essentially like, looking at calls coming in and, looking at, videos of various incidents. So those are parts of the ecosystem that will get hit first, because, they have to be more or kind of like, the word that we always use, right? Intentional, right? They have to be more intentional in cleaning up their data first and getting the AI, removing or eliminating or reducing the bias, right? And I think that will very soon, fall into retailers and others over time, because now currently a lot of the things that you're seeing in the bias that you're seeing in retail is very benign sort of bias, right? I think consumers are more tolerant about it. But as as consumers see the AI is performing better, the biases are getting eradicated or handled in some form or fashion, this will get the expectation to provide a non-biased AI will be much, much higher, right? And especially like a lot of the major companies, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, the GAFA, or the FANG companies, however you call them, right? They are putting a lot of intentional R&D in eradicating this type of problem. You can never eradicate it, you can reduce it, right? Because the systems are always going to have something will show up somewhere. But they are also great ways to, just like privacy and security, right? If you look at privacy and security today, right, it's a problem for 90% of the companies that are out there, right? But if you look at somebody like Apple, if you look at the last set of iOS releases they made, they are making that a feature, right? It's no longer a problem, but rather the part of the solution, right? Similar, so now consumers are going to suddenly say, okay, if I use an iPhone, the iPhone's going to protect my information, right? I'll give you a classic example, right? You share a bunch of pictures or videos on your iPhone. Say if I take a bunch of pictures and I text it to you, iPhone's texting application will automatically remove all my geolocations that all the cameras capture, right? Because that's a form of inherent implicit security that's built into the platform, right? So users of iPhone and Apple products are much more secure than other users of other products, right? Because Apple is converting that into a feature and a capability for the user, right? So one of the things that retailers, brands, and even non-retail companies should look at: how do I take AI bias not as a problem, but rather as a feature, something that can help, not the bias, but the eradication of the bias or the elimination or the effort to reduce bias as a feature, right? And that can be, consumers will reciprocate. They'll respond very positively towards that.
I have some eye-popping numbers I can share about the impact of AI bias. So based on our research, according to Gartner, through 2022, 85% of AI projects will deliver erroneous outcomes due to bias in data, algorithms, or teams responsible for managing them. 76% of CEOs are most concerned with the potential for bias and lack of transparency when it comes to AI adoption. And this is according to PwC. So specifically for retail, we understand that because you're working in a lot of cases with a B2C market and consumer market, and the way that news travels these days, there's huge reputational risks if you don't take this very, very seriously. The last thing for a retail leader is you don't want your organization to kind of be labeled or hashtag for something that really you could have addressed very early on, especially with the ease of people communicating and the type of demographics you want to reach out. This is something that we do find there's solutions we can implement to mitigate these effects of AI bias.
Wow, that's pretty sobering numbers. Brian, if I'm buying AI right now as an end user, as a retailer, CPG, how do I I test the bias? How do I know how big of a problem it is, or what do I have to do to evolve? And I know we're very early on in this whole process. So, what are you advising your clients how to protect them?
There are a number of things that are available there, Jeff. There are a series of frameworks that are there. There are a series of toolkits that are available out there that can help you verify some of these biases, right? The other is also the general diligence or questionnaire that retailers and brands could go through. When they're selecting an AI vendor, right? To make sure that these biases are either taken care or at least at a minimum thought through, right? So there are definitely toolkits and capabilities that are out there, and Solomon can tell you more about them as well.
Sure. So going back to the solutions I mentioned, we do look at it in terms of frameworks, tools, processes, and policy. And all these things are interconnected, and they're not necessarily independent of each other. So if you want to look at a very holistic solution, you do want to have some kind of framework. You do want to identify certain tools that you can use to not just remove bias, but also detect them. When you think about processes, you're talking about actions and steps, such as defining metrics and testing as a way to de-bias AI and increase people's trust in these systems. And then last but not least, when we talk about policy, this is the governance around AI to make sure that the blind spots that you have are not ignored, and be able to take actions that mitigate them when they're offered.
The other thing that also happens is some of the, like we said before, the FANG or the GAFA companies are putting a lot of research. There is a lot of tools that they have all brought to market, right? Like Google has something called the What If tool. IBM has an AI fairness tools, right? And there's quite a lot of open source tools that are out there that will sort of test various sort of bias hypotheses and help you validate, right? But what's interesting though with AI bias is depending on the problem you're trying to solve, the bias can be very deep and completely undetectable, right? That's also a problem, right? Depending on what the solution is, depending on what use case it is, right? But most use cases, there are tools, especially in image recognition or things like credit scoring or data scoring. There are quite a lot of tools that are out there where you can benchmark against what you have.
Well, this market never ceases to evolve dramatically or create new and interesting problems and challenges. In kind of wrapping up, Brian, what do we all need to think about to move this to be smart in our evolution of AI, but also be aggressive?
See, I think, Jeff, there are a couple of things, right? First of all, at a very high level, this is an arm's length race and an exacerbating problem, right? What I mean by that is, today, as organizations are using AI, sort of the applied AI, right, or the horizontal AI, right, where they're taking AI and applying AI across all the different problems, right? As they are doing that, they are going to create more and more biases because traditional human data that's captured is already heavily biased. The historical data is biased. The aggregation data is biased, right? All those biases exist. So AI is going to sort of exacerbate that bias, right? So that's going to happen. The other thing that's happening is as AI research is happening on the other side, not on the applied AI side, but on the research side, they're coming up with more and more advanced algorithms to solve many different use cases that cannot be solved today through regular applied AI, right? As those things are coming in, those techniques are coming in, like, for example, synthetic data generation, right? Or transfer learning. That means taking data from one model and kind of, putting it into another situation and using that data to learn, right? Or things like GAN networks, right? Adversarial networks. All these things, right? Reinforcement learning, all these different AI capabilities. And there are lots and lots of new things coming in, right? All these things coming in, they are all going to actually be susceptible to new forms of biases that we don't even know yet, right? Then this problem will continue to grow as we introduce AI more and more, right, as a technology, right? And then also as we have old data, right? It's sort of like the new wine in the old old glass or the old cup type of an example, right? Where AI might be new, the algorithm might be new, but the data is very old. So as both mature, things will get a lot better, right? And this will always continue to be an arm's length race, just like security. But I think companies that understand this race and take the problem and turn it into an opportunity, and not make it a bug, but rather a feature, a capability that can address some of the customer needs by eliminating, or not eliminating, but rather reducing bias, will always have great products, and that can be an opportunity to gain customer confidence and penetrate markets.
Wow, very interesting. In wrapping up, Solomon, Brian, any final thoughts?
Solomon, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So I'll kind of conclude going back to what we discussed at the top of this conversation, saying that where these biases coming from, and they're all, again, we said these are cognitive bias that come from human biases, and then the potential or the lack of complete data. And again, I want to repeat kind of the mantra from Google, where they talk about inclusive inputs lead to inclusive outputs. So you have to be very intentional about this. We understand AI is a tool. So then and we know that human biases are kind of playing a big role in how these things factor out. So when you kind of take it from that point of view, anything that you do with AI, whether it's you're taking a sample data set for a certain group, you have to be very intentional to kind of think, am I going to have a representation bias in here? Do I cover all of the demographics I want to cover? If not, what are the solutions to that? Do I go sample for other sources? Do I use methods of synthetic data to boost my existing sample set? There could be things such as evaluation bias. The results I'm getting here, is this very accurate of this particular group? Am I using the correct benchmarks? We talked a little bit about the aggregation bias. There's even things like deployment bias. Like, what are the conclusions I'm getting from my results? Am I misinterpreting these, or is this appropriate for the group I'm talking about? So all these biases I talk about, there are tools that we can use to mitigate it, but it really starts about us as humans and being very intentional about recognizing our biases and then applying a policy, tools, processes, frameworks to address them.
Thank you, Solomon. That's actually a great summary. I think you kind of, sort of captured everything together, right? And I want to sort of build on top of that, because I think, Jeff, remember we used to speak about this all the time, like, what do I do on Monday? Right. So, if you are a leader, right, of an organization, and if you are hearing this podcast, right, and what do you do on Monday, right? So maybe I will leave you with a few thoughts, and this might help you. First, I think is learn as much as possible about AI bias, right? Because I think knowledge sort of is freedom, right? So understanding it deeply is a good thing. And of course, press, of course, always has, their own biases on top of AI's bias, right? It's not all AI's fault. I mean, if you get the data right, if you, like Solomon said, if you build an inclusive platform, you can reduce some of these things. So learn, first step. Second is take your current organizational product offerings and even use cases and think through, how do I apply AI, and where does these biases can occur, right? And are they benign, or can they become serious, right? And if I were to remove some of these biases, will my customers appreciate it? Will that become an opportunity for me for me and my company, right? Third is sort of put together a very simple questionnaire and talk to your vendors who are providing you AI solutions to make sure they take intentional actions to eliminate the biases, right? Because I think the more questions the retailers, brands, And purchasing organizations are going to ask vendors about the bias. Vendors are going to have to make changes and build platforms that have less bias, right? So that's an important one, right? And then finally, as you collect data within your company, look at, how do we eliminate aggregation biases? How do we eliminate historical biases, right? Those are the 4 steps that I would sort of take as the next step.
Well, that sounds like probably a pretty good place to cut it off. Brian Solomon, as always, thank you. Sometimes you scare me. Sometimes I just had never really thought about the challenges of this when you think about it from a retail perspective, where we literally deal with everybody on the planet and all the places that a bias can be a problem, and we've got it in droves. So thanks again, and we will continue this conversation.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Solomon.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And after all, it's better to know than to not know, right?
That is for sure. Thanks, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode. For more info, refer to the pod notes below. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps us grow. I'm your host, Jeff Roster, analyst at large. If you want to connect, follow us on Twitter at JeffPR or at BrianSathanation, or connect with us on LinkedIn. Visit my website at roster.retail.com or Brian's at iterate.ai. Until next time, stay safe and have a great week.